Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 5 of the U.S. and the World, American Empire. I'm titling this lecture Aggressors in Quarantine, borrowing from a phrase from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who will be the main person in focus this time. So I'll be proceeding in 3 parts, talking about the United States during the Depression and trying to put that in a bit of an international context. Then I'll be talking about the idea of isolationism and talk about the crisis of World War II as it approached, and thinking about the U.S. In some ways kind of official reluctance to get involved. I'll talk about events in Europe and Asia, the 2 crises that lead up to U.S. involvement in World War II. And then I'll say a bit about the U.S. at war in the global war of World War II. And I'll take it through to, not to the very end of the war, but through most of it. And then I'll pick up kind of the end of the war and its aftermath next time. So for today's walk, I'm going to take the Soho Loop, which is a nice canal walk in the area here, not too far from where I live. The weather, though, let's take a look outside. The weather looks like it's raining. What time is it? It's almost 4 o'clock here, and I haven't been outside yet today, so I need to get out there. The weather doesn't look great, but let's see if I can get through this lecture and take us for a walk around the Soho Loop before it gets dark. Okay, more in a minute. Okay, hi everybody. Setting out here at the corner of Reservoir and Monument Road, similarly to as I did last time. It's a bit windy and kind of cold, but let's see how I do. Someone just honked at me, I think. Who could that be? Anyways, okay, so the interwar period then. The interwar period, we already need to start with terminology here, because interwar is kind of one of those strange terms to refer to a time period that makes it seem like it isn't important in and of itself, that it's in between 2 other important things, wars in this case. And even more so makes it seem that the people living in that time, for whom obviously history was unfolding, as it is for everybody, towards the future, but makes it seem like for them they're kind of waiting for something that happens in the future, which, in the 1920s especially, it wasn't at all a given that was going to happen. So interwar is kind of a strange terminology, and probably more accurate for us, even though I sometimes fall into calling it that. Maybe better to call it the 1920s and 1930s. In any case, it's not entirely true. Oh yeah, the other term we should talk about here, of course, is isolation. And isolation is a complicated term too, because isolation can happen in terms of formal diplomatic relations, but of course it can also happen in terms of, cultural or other kinds of connections between one country and another. So we want to think about it in those multiple layers, and think about interaction in terms of those multiple layers as well. So it's sometimes thought that the quote-unquote interwar, or 20s and 30s time period, is more of an isolationist one after the kind of high point of Wilsonian internationalism in U.S. history. And that's not entirely true, partly because officially, formally at the government level, the 1930s were more isolationist than the 1930s were more isolationist than the 1920s, which you'll kind of see throughout this lecture. And again, as I mentioned, isolation and interaction aren't just a matter of government policies as well. Okay, but to the main president that we want to talk about this time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. So FDR, perhaps the most important president in U.S. history. He's president during 2 hugely significant events, the Depression and World War II. He's also president who serves 4 terms, which no other president has done. And legally, after him, no other president will be able to do unless they change that rule. So he came from a prominent New York family. And like his older cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, who I've mentioned before, FDR served as the Assistant Secretary to the Navy and Governor of New York before he became the president. So, you know, again, his presidency had to face this immediate crisis of the Great Depression when he came into office in 1933 after winning the election in 1932. And that was the main, far and away, the main order of business was the economic crisis within the country. And as Roosevelt himself proclaimed, quote, "Our international trade relations, though vastly important, are in point of time and necessity secondary to the establishment of a sound national economy, and I favor, as practical policy, the putting of first things first." So clearly a domestic focus here as Roosevelt comes into office. And again, the Depression was such a grave economic crisis that it's no surprise that he did this. Unemployment was sitting at about 25%. Hunger and homelessness were on the rise. The investment had shrunk almost to a complete, almost to zero. The economy when Roosevelt first came into office was almost at a complete standstill. So within his first year of the presidency then, or famously his first 100 days, he sets about trying to address this crisis. Now, this doesn't mean that foreign relations were entirely absent in his agenda. Within his first year, for example, Roosevelt recognized the Soviet Union and established formal diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union for the first time since the revolution there in 1917. But again, rather than seeing this just as a period of isolation, the 1920s and which I'm talking about more here, the 1930s, that informal register that I mentioned before is key for us to keep in mind. And so this is a time when US culture very much interacted with the rest of the world, as it was doing before, and of course as it did afterwards. So Hollywood is one example of what this looks like. Let me see here. By 1928, US movies took up 25% of Japan's film market and almost half of Germany's and 2/3 that of France and Italy. In the UK, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil, the figure was between 80 and 95%. So Hollywood, you know, not only interacting, but really dominating film markets overseas. King Kong, which brought in $2 million in its initial release in 1933, broke all box office records, and it was also an international sensation. While James Cagney, Mae West, and Cary Grant also became, you know, really international stars at this time. They're certainly not only famous within Hollywood. Cecil B. DeMille's 1934 lavish production of Cleopatra, meanwhile, starred Claudette Colbert, who was one of Hollywood's most famous actors in the mid-1930s. Now this film featured extensive sets and you know, again, lavish costumes. The veil on one of Colbert's outfits, for example, weighed 73 pounds. So, and these kind of, you know, sort of stats around Hollywood spending and productions were talked about and covered in the international, you know, conversation about these things, again, as well as within the U.S. This film was nominated for 5 Oscars. I've shown this film before in this class. It's quite significant. Most people tend to know the later version starring Elizabeth Taylor that came out in the 1960s, but there's this earlier and really important, and in its time, very well-known example as well. So, second here. So this film, Connected, is another example, again, of what I'm saying. We might think that isolationism is on the rise in terms of formal foreign policy, but here's another example of something else going on that connects the U.S. to the rest of the world in more significant ways. So again, it was a box office hit and screened in foreign markets around the world. Cleopatra is also important because it's an example of the West's imperial fascination with the East, imagined as strange and feminine and excessive and exotic, what other scholars have called Orientalism. So we can see, a clear example of this with this film as well. So I want to point not only to the fact of these, blockbusters and the kind of representations they involve, but also the content of them as well. Okay, so further in this theme, this wasn't the only Depression era product that brought the U.S. to the rest of the world. The 1939 hit Stagecoach, which was directed by John Ford and starred John Wayne, and was yet another example, if we think about it in terms of content, here, not so much Orientalism, but more settler colonialism on the screen, was another, huge hit with international audiences. So again, politically, the U.S. may have been, retreating during the years of the Roosevelt administration from the international arena, but in terms of culture and cultural connections, there's quite a bit more going on. Okay, but back to formal policy then. One of FDR's most important foreign policy initiatives was the Good Neighbor policy. And this is vis-a-vis Latin America, and it was aimed to foster better relations, after the kinds of military interventions of presidents going back at least to 1898 in the region. So this was an attempt to set, at least in tone, a different kind of policy relationship between the U.S. and Latin America. So let me see here. So perhaps the best example, this is a good example of the Good Neighbor policy, is vis-a-vis Mexico. In 1938, the Mexican government under Lázaro Cárdenas, they nationalized oil, and the oil industry had, no shortage of U.S. investment in it. And the oil companies were, well represented in Washington. They have powerful connections, of course, as they do today. They have a voice in, or at least influence on, the making of foreign policy. And here was the U.S.'s immediate neighbor to the south, having nationalized the oil industry, and therefore claiming, the property, essentially, of U.S. corporations. This obviously wasn't met. This wasn't well received by the U.S. Oil industry. And so pressure was put on FDR to do something about this, to intervene. And he didn't. He respected Mexican sovereignty in this case. And Mexico itself is, in the 1930s, coming out of the long history of its own revolution, which began just before World War I. And led to a lot of kind of different factions and different groups vying for power. By the time Cárdenas is in office, the situation in Mexico had stabilized around, kind of contradictorily, institutional Revolutionary Party, which was in this moment bringing in some of these left-wing reforms, and also dealing with their own crisis of the Depression. In any case, Roosevelt respects Cárdenas's decision here, and this is quite an important symbol of the idea that the Good Neighbor policy could have real content. It's not just necessarily a kind of a tone, but it can actually matter in terms of direct policy. Okay. So another example, or another kind of way of thinking, though, important way of thinking about the Good Neighbor policy, is it also means that U.S. respect for Latin American sovereignty means U.S. support for authoritarian dictatorships around Latin American countries as well. And so this is another way that the U.S. Maintains, favorable relations through governments that were favorable to the United States, but nonetheless oppressive and exploitative towards their own people, in places like Nicaragua and the Somoza family, for instance. In Cuba, the government, Roosevelt's government, was worried about the possibility of political instability, and supported an army sergeant, Fulgencio Batista, who came to power in Cuba in 1934. He ultimately made the island, again, a place of authoritarian rule, but also friendly to U.S. business interests, which of course very much continued, under the terms of the Platt Amendment and with the informal kind of imperial relationship that the United States had vis-a-vis Cuba from the 1890s onward. So FDR made loans to Batista, and created conditions for the export of particularly sugar from the Cuban island.
Thank you.
No problem. And very significantly, FDR rescinded the Platt Amendment. So here also is an example of FDR's good neighbor policy at work. In this case, respecting the sovereignty more so of the Cuban government under the authoritarian and U.S. kind of friendly Batista. But also there were limits even to this kind of move, because FDR, there was one exception in the one plank of the or one clause in the Platt Amendment that stayed, and that was the United States holding on to the base at Guantanamo, which of course it infamously holds to this day. Okay, so meanwhile, in the Pacific, fighting there, and this is kind of moving on the road to World War II, and you'll see here that I'm going to kind of jump back and forth between Asia and Europe here as I lay this out. So fighting in the Pacific began in several stages. In 1931, the Japanese military occupied Manchuria, renaming it Manchukuo the following year. You'll see that on the map that I put on the slide. The United States, I should say, did not recognize this acquisition, and the League of Nations complained about this territorial change that was brought about by force. But the Japanese government simply withdrew from the League of Nations and ignored its critics, and continued to expand its empire on the Asian mainland. In 1937, Japan extended its invasion into the rest of China with horrific results. The Japanese army was given free rein to abuse the citizens, most infamously at Nanjing in 1937. The results included civilians being deliberately killed, used for target practice, this kind of thing. Just horrific atrocities were part of the invasion and occupation of this Chinese city. And the most infamous of all the atrocities here were the examples of deliberate, of course deliberate, but systematic sexual violence on the part of the soldiers against the citizens, especially the women of this city. So this was an example of empire building and imperial expansion with great brutality that was also sort of looked upon with horror by observers from around the world. Okay, so the Chinese government, in the face of this, pulled back, and this was under Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. They retreat to Chongqing, further inland. They move away essentially from the Japanese forces. And Japan is never able to conquer the entirety. The Japanese military is not able to conquer the entirety of China during the conflict. Excuse me. Okay, so in any case, from the United States point of view, people are watching this, and again with horror, but it doesn't translate into support for a U.S. declaration of war or the U.S. getting militarily involved. Opinion surveys were just starting to come into use in this period, and one U.S. poll in 1937 indicated that fully 95% of the U.S. population agreed that the country should stay out of any future war in the region. And this opinion applied not only to Asia, but also to Europe, where the rise of authoritarian populism drastically altered the political balance of power, as you all know, in the European continent. In the 1920s, beginning in Italy, of course, with the rise to power of Benito Mussolini's fascists there, and let me say something about that for a minute, because the Italian example is important in its own right. It's important for European history. It's important for the establishment of fascism, and then therefore the example that it creates. Of course, emulated or inspired in Germany afterwards, and really key for our purposes here is also important in terms of the relationship between fascism and imperialism, and we're going to want to think about those together in the Italian example and also the German one as well. It's sometimes the case that fascism is studied and thought of as sort of a separate topic from imperialism, but in this class you won't be surprised to see that I want to kind of bring them together a bit more here as well, and to see Italian foreign policy and German foreign policy as also examples of kind of empire building as well, in a world of empires that the United States interacts in and is itself a different kind of example of. Okay, so let me see here. So in the Italian example, then, of course, I want to point to the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. So Ethiopia was one of the only remaining spaces on the African continent that had not been colonized by European power. Italy had tried before, actually, in the 1890s, and were militarily defeated in the process. They were unsuccessful. And part of the kind of fascist imperialist relationship here is that, fascism in Italy, it was a kind of populism, but it didn't challenge the power of the elites, but rather kind of mobilized the masses around great displays of nationalism and, of course, war-making, imperial expansion, and these sort of ideas of the grandeur of a new Rome were all part of this as well. So the Ethiopian Emperor, Haile Selassie, put the nation's plight when his country was invaded before the League of Nations, famously. Especially as the Italian military with its warplanes, used poison gas and was dropping bombs on civilians. Another example of empire building with brutal violence against civilians. In the United States, the population of the United States, the people were watching this, but it also kind of came down differently along racial lines. African Americans, Italian Americans tended to, though not all of them, some of them really opposed it, but many Italian Americans supported Italy here. But this was an issue of great interest and great urgency for African Americans who mobilized against the Italian invasion, and also really brought public attention to the issue all the more so. So FDR's government opted to remain neutral, again in keeping with its sort of formal isolationism of the time. And it was in this context that that Congress passed the Neutrality Act. So here it is in official name in legislation, also in 1935. And this prevented the U.S. from officially sponsoring either side, Italy or Ethiopia. In this case, the invaders, the Italian invaders or the invaded Ethiopians in this example. Okay, switching now to something that you no doubt already know a fair bit about. Mussolini's most famous enthusiast was, of course, Adolf Hitler. And his National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis for short, was formed after World War I. And they were able to capitalize on nationalist sentiment after the war, and obviously very central to their program, and in some respects their popularity, was their anti-Semitism, their anti-Jewish racism. In 1923, they made an attempt to seize power in Munich, ultimately unsuccessful. Hitler served a prison term. While he was in prison, he wrote his autobiography, Mein Kampf, which again, pointed his hatred towards or expressed, I should say, his hatred towards the Jewish people, and put forward this kind of vision for, very nationalist German greatness as well. And Germany was hit hard by the Depression, and so again, he was able to, sort of capitalize on this situation. Later, Hitler's able to maneuver his way into power by 1933, and as soon as Nazi power was secure, as soon as they had enough of a position in government, after Hitler was appointed chancellor by Hindenburg, the Nazis began to immediately persecute Jewish Germans, and seizing their property, forbidding marriage or sexual relations between Jewish Germans and other Germans, forcing families to leave the country, barring Jewish Germans from government positions, bringing in the Nuremberg laws in 1935, which really all the more enshrined anti-Semitism in law. And so the point I want to make here about this is, again, to put that in an international context, that Hitler's anti-Semitic ideas were neither original nor unusual in the 1930s. We know where this goes in German history, and it goes to, an unimaginably horrific place in terms of the extremity and the scale. But also, of course, and I think you probably already know this, anti-Semitism is, runs through Western societies, and not just Germany alone. And importantly, also important for us to remember here, that the Nazis theorized Jewish identity as a biological rather than cultural or religious idea, and this was significant in terms of the kind of ways that eugenic racism, which again was hugely part of scientific thought in many countries at this time, could express itself in the worst possible ways in government policy. Okay, just move over a little bit here. Okay, so this, by the way, I don't know if you've ever been here before, this is the Soho Loop. So this is, well, not to get into a sidebar history lesson here, but this is, and maybe you know more about this than me, but it's a loop because this is the original canal for this area, and they built it to follow the contour line that was all at the same level, that was easier to dig it. And then I think this is in the late 18th century, and then in the early 19th century they then built the other part of the canal, which I'm going to walk back on, which I was on before, which is the straight part that goes kind of directly towards the city center. Okay, just going to move over here for a minute. Okay, so where was I? So obviously didn't have elections when Hitler was in power. Right, but we can see examples, and I put a number of images up there. I'm sure, you know, at least some of them you've seen before, that also show us, though, that Hitler wasn't simply, you know, him and a small group of people were a dictatorship imposed upon the German people, but, you know, with some Germans, with a not small number of Germans, this was a popular government, and the anti-Semitism of Nazism was not a barrier to that popularity, and probably to some degree was a reason for it. So, so this is important for us to keep in mind as well. And also, of course, Hitler fostered a real kind of sense of, you know, intense nationalism. And this was on display during the Olympics in 1936, which was a major sort of PR success, really, for the Nazi government. Okay, it's hard to see my notes because of this rain. And now I've just made it worse. Let's see. Okay, so, well, here maybe I'll take a break here because I've just lost my notes altogether, and then I'll pick this up in a moment. Okay, hang on. Okay, back again. Who knew that lecturing in the rain was gonna cause these problems? I haven't lectured in the rain before, so I'm learning as I go. Okay, let me say a couple of things just about the crisis in Europe then, to finish off that section in the 1930s. So as I was saying, the Berlin Olympics in '36 were, you know, viewed by Hitler as a success, and kind of one of the next major international events that the Nazis were involved in was the Civil War in Spain, and the seizure of power, well, the war that led to the seizure of power by the also fascist General Franco there, saw German and indeed Italian involvement in the conflict against the Spanish Republic, which was supported by the Soviet Union with its own agenda, and by kind of international brigades that were assembled to fight against fascism in, you know, what some saw later as kind of a dress rehearsal for World War II itself. So the U.S. maintained neutrality here, and it also did so as, you know, sort of crisis after crisis. When Hitler's next kind of clear, the place he next took aim at was Czechoslovakia. First, the Sudetenland, which you know, Chamberlain, Neville Chamberlain, and the other and some of the other leaders in that moment, 1938. This is at this point, agreed to let the Nazis take over, which then subsequently was followed by them taking the rest of Czechoslovakia as well. For our purposes here, thinking about this series of events and this crisis after crisis, which, as we know, ultimately led to World War II, the United States remains neutral in the face of all of this and doesn't see its interests as being served by getting involved. Okay, moving into the second part here then, now thinking about how, so we know that there isn't a lot of US public support. There's no majority support for military involvement in the crises in Asia or in Europe. But we also know that the United States does ultimately become an important player and play an important military role in World War II. So how does this come about? Let's walk through this a little bit here. So, okay, so, right. So thinking about World War II then, as the actual, you know, full-scale military conflict arrives, and we can think about, you know, some of the reasons for this. Obviously, it's the aggressive and expansionist policies of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany are part of this. But also we can, and of course, you know, as is always noted, the unresolved issues of World War I play a role here. But of course, as you also probably know, that sometimes simplistically kind of explained as just through the Treaty of Versailles in terms of the reparations and so on for Germany. But I also want us to think about, again, imperialism as a system and the way that the Treaty of Versailles, its aftermath, and the mandate system expand the imperial system, and therefore leave intact one of the main problems that led to World War I in the first place. So this remains the case. Imperialism as a cause of World War I is also something we can think of as a cause of World War II. Okay, now in Europe, the war itself gets formally underway at the beginning of September of 1939 when Germany invades Poland. There were, this is followed then within a couple of days by declarations of war from principally Britain, but also some of its allies. This doesn't really have an effect because Germany is able to, with the exception of obviously the significant exception of Polish resistance, is able though mostly to enjoy a kind of, overwhelming balance of power in its favor vis-a-vis Poland across the month of September of 1939. Let's see here. So ultimately, again, as you know, the Nazis are able to conquer France by 1940 and move into a position there, which finally, in a way, it still doesn't bring the U.S. public around to the idea of wanting to be in the war directly. But the fall of Paris brings the war to, the shocking fall of Paris brings the war to U.S. publics in a more significant way and makes them more predisposed to well, not necessarily to wanting to fight, but definitely to having a very, very strong interest in the conflict. Okay, I've just lost my phone again. I think it's just getting too wet. So I'm going to take one more break and see if I can sort this back out. Okay, sorry about this. Give me a minute. Okay, one more attempt here. Let's see how I do. As I was saying, the fall of France really brings, the events in Europe home in a shocking and frightening way to U.S. publics. But again, this didn't mean that the majority in the United States wanted a declaration of war. But the public discussion, nonetheless, was really significant around this. And Henry Luce, who I put on the slide here, on one of the slides, he wrote this influential article called "The American Century." It's referred to this day, and it advocates that in the crises of the moment, the United States has a responsibility to be involved. And this is really, if we think about isolationism as a policy position, this is a strong critique of it, and this is really its opposite. And I think one of the reasons why it's such a touchstone is because this is written before Pearl Harbor, before U.S. military involvement in the war directly, but it in some ways kind of sets the tone for U.S. involvement. We might say that sets the tone for the kind of form of U.S. empire that comes after World War II. Now, you won't find Luce saying, the United States needs to be an imperial force in the world. No. But this is a benevolent vision, which we may think of as an imperial one. And it's in a tradition, going back to Woodrow Wilson, going back to Thomas Jefferson, of ideas of a kind of benevolent interaction between the U.S. and the wider world that Luce, in an influential way, is putting forward here. Okay, he's not the only one. He's not the only advocate of an expanded role for the United States here, and the Neutrality Act has a growing number of critics, particularly as the UK is standing alone after the fall of France and is being bombed by Germany. Isolationists, though, are there on the scene, and people like Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot and right-wing figure of the moment, is one of the strong voices continuing, and also a Nazi sympathizer, is someone who is continuing to have an influential voice for U.S. For the U.S. staying out of the events in Europe, even though the Nazis by this point now are into 1941 have conquered so much of the continent. So, as I guess sort of a halfway measure, the U.S. government responds by supporting Britain with Lend-Lease. This idea: we'll lend you the stuff you need, or some of the stuff that you need for the moment. You can pay us back later. And this is sort of, it's not the good neighbor policy, because that was vis-a-vis Latin America, but it is sort of articulated as good neighborly. In fact, in the story that FDR tells to justify this, he positions the U.S. as indeed a neighbor lending a hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. So that's sort of the way in which FDR articulates this, through the metaphor of neighbors again. So meanwhile, in Asia, the defeat of various European imperial powers, probably most importantly France here, but also the Netherlands, whose important colony of Indonesia was there. So the defeat of, or in the British case, the preoccupation of the European imperial powers with events in Europe, leave their Asian colonies exposed. And of course, Imperial Japan has designs on them, in part to fuel its own war effort with some of the resources that are available in places like Vietnam, for instance. So Japanese imperial power is expanding. Maybe most symbolically and famously with the fall of Singapore, as Japanese armies are defeating European ones and taking their colonial territories from them. And of course, this is leading to tension, but not war, between the United States and Japan. But the United States begins embargoing Japan and not selling certain important raw materials to them as well. Oil ultimately being the most important one here. So in Europe, the German government makes the fateful decision in 1941, June 22nd, 1941, of invading the Soviet Union. And this is, massive, and again, so much of World War II, the scale of it is so unimaginable. And the Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, is an example, both in the scale of the military conflict and in the wide, massive scale and horrific brutalities carried out against Soviet civilian citizens as well. Germany, amasses a massive army to carry this out, and 4 million soldiers, I think it is, altogether as part of this invasion force. They gain ground quickly. They destroy much of the Soviet air force within the first few days. And within the first few weeks, they're advancing quickly eastward in Soviet territory. So this is blitzkrieg brought to the Soviets. And then ultimately, of course, the final step. So this is just intensifying the fighting and the attention on it from the other powers. And again, the United States is watching all of this closely. And then December, at the end of the year, on the 7th, the Japanese forces attack the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and this ultimately then brings the United States formally into the war with a declaration against Japan. And it's one of the most famous speeches in foreign policy history. And I put a copy up on the slide of the working draft, and you can see that Roosevelt was making edits and thinking about how he was going to word this very important speech right up to the last minute. So So with this event, then, the United States is formally in the war, and I'll pick this up in a minute and talk about the kind of the events of the U.S. involvement in the war from the end of 41 through to 1944. Okay, more in a minute. Okay, carrying on. I think my phone is dead, so I'll just talk. That's probably better than trying to consult these few notes that I have anyways. And let me point out here, I'm just concluding this part of the Soho Loop and heading on to the direct part of the canal here, which will bring me back to the direct straight part of the canal that will bring me back to where I was at the outset. Here's a sign here which shows us Birmingham one way, Wolverhampton the other. Okay, so let me just say a few more things about World War II here. So the first is that after Pearl Harbor, and I misspoke a minute ago if I suggested that the fall of Singapore was before Pearl Harbor, because of course it's afterwards. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military, moves from advance to advance, taking more territory and more areas from, obviously taking over the populations who live in Southeast Asia and in Indonesia and in the Philippines, important for the U.S. example here, and taking these territories from the other imperial powers as they do so. So it's advance after advance here. Similarly, the German invasion of the Soviet Union continues at fast pace. Germany covers a lot of Soviet territory, and then ultimately the Wehrmacht is bogged down at Stalingrad, Moscow, and Leningrad. Leningrad, a horrendous siege takes place. The city is starved but holds on. Moscow, the German army makes it to the outskirts of the city, but is unable to ultimately take over, to conquer the Soviet capital. And Stalingrad, maybe the most famous of them all, in which the German army does take the city, but under Stalin's orders, the Soviet Red Army is ordered to take it back, and the fighting is intense, block by block, tanks, infantry. There's even some civilians in Stalingrad during this, which is hard to fathom. Ultimately, a defeat for the German army. But then also the battle at Kursk, the massive tank battle, which is again in keeping with World War II of mind-bending scale. The landscape, the size, I should say, the battlefield of Kursk is, I read somewhere, is it's the size of the country of Wales. Just to give you an example, hundreds of tanks on both sides, a massive tank battle that takes place here. And after this point, the Red Army is now, the tide is turned and the Red Army is advancing the other way. So maybe, I'm not a military historian, maybe Stalingrad is the turning point, maybe Kursk is. Others could say more in terms of the specifics. But if we think about them together, by the beginning of 1944, the Red Army is advancing and the German army is retreating. In the Asian theater, the tide ultimately, of course, turns there, and the gamble, Pearl Harbor on the part of the Japanese command was, of course, a gamble to knock out U.S. power and sort of, deter the United States from trying to get involved further. It obviously has the opposite effect, but it was meant to give the Japanese military a free hand in Asia. And as I've talked about before, if we think about going back to the mid-19th century, the United States on one hand, on one side of the Pacific, and Japan on the other, as two rising industrial empires at this time, we can think about Pearl Harbor as, certainly not an inevitable conclusion, but we can think about it in a different context from the one that presents it sometimes as just one of history's great surprises. Rather, we can see it in against this kind of background context of two competing empires on either side of the Pacific, whose rivalry is intensifying and ultimately leads to this direct conflict between them. So the United States is able, with its massive economy, is able to put more, is able to build more ships, is able to build more armaments, is able to outpace the Japanese economy, while at the same time, the United States is able to give lend-lease aid to the Soviets and boost Britain as well. And so, of course, World War II, being a war of economies, means that the United States is in sort of the best position as far as a country that has a very large and growing economy, first of all, and coming out of the Depression. This is the Depression now being reversed into geared up production, while at the same time also being, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, essentially free of the actual military conflict. The citizens of the United States are not having to worry about being bombed every night or invaded. I mean, some might be worried about this. And some of that worry is also expressed through racism, in that German Americans do not receive the same treatment as Japanese Americans within the United States. And I'm talking here about the internment of Japanese Americans in the United States when they posed no credible threat. At the time, this was about race. This wasn't about actual sort of security policy. But in any case, there's essentially, the United States is a space where there's a lack of direct military engagement compared to the other powers who are involved in this war. So the U.S. economy is really key here in turning the tide in Asia as well, because Pearl Harbor doesn't knock the U.S. out. The U.S. is able to mobilize more and more of its forces, and ultimately General Douglas MacArthur returns to the Philippines, as he had promised to do, before the end of 1944. So I want to bring things to a close there, and next time maybe I won't lecture in the rain. Maybe that's not such a good idea. Next time I'll pick things up. Well, let me say one other thing, because I think I also do mention this in the slides, is that another aspect of World War II, aside from all of this military stuff I'm talking about, also World War II is a moment that expands U.S. influence and U.S. relations to places and with powers that they had next to no kind of interaction with before. So Saudi Arabia is a good example here. And Saudi Arabia is important, of course, as we know, because of oil, even though that's not, that comes to be more the contours and the kind of extent to which Saudi Arabian oil deposits are going to be significant comes later. But one thing that World War II demonstrates to everybody is the importance of oil for fighting, the importance of oil for industry in general, and the importance of oil for fighting modern military industrial warfare. The U.S. Navy just on its own consumes a massive amounts of oil during the war. Part of the Nazi invasion and push into Soviet territory is importantly about racism and about anti-Semitism, anti-Slavic racism, and the German sort of Nazi plans for an expanded German empire. But it's also about getting hold of Russian oil resources as well. So we just want to keep this in the background as we think about U.S. relations with other parts of the world, like new kind of relations in the Middle East, and here an alliance between, or the beginning of kind of relations, diplomatic relations between King Ibn Saud and Franklin Roosevelt here as well. World War II also has an important impact for U.S. Latin American relations with the Bracero program. in which workers, primarily from Mexico, are able to come into the United States and work in a moment of labor shortage, with soldiers off in the war as well. So it has a number of other, just wanted to conclude by saying that, a number of other kind of important implications that aren't only military. So next time then, I'll pick up with the concluding parts of the war. They're important enough to merit their own discussion. I'll do that next time. And then talk about what comes after the war as well. Okay, so with that, here you can just show you where I am now. I'm just heading back to where I started along the canal. You can see the city center there in the distance. Okay, everybody, hope you're doing well, and I'll see you in seminar. Bye. Hi everyone, just thought I'd add a postscript today. I'm almost home now. You can see I'm back at Monument and Reservoir Road, but it got dark and it really started to pour with rain, so good thing I guess good thing I'm almost home. Okay, just thought I'd add that. See you all soon.